All right. Well, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. Today I'm joined by Dr. David Christian, who is a professor emeritus in the Department of History and Archaeology and former director of the Big History Institute at Macquarie University. Additionally, he was the founding president of the International Big History Association, wrote the first published monograph on Big History, and is a co-founder of the Big History Project. Lastly, he is also the author of many books on Big History. So, Dr. Christian, thanks for coming on today.
Pleasure.
So, when did you first get interested in history?
In history, it's kind of strange because I was never terribly good at history at school, and I was taught a kind of, history as a sequence of facts. I think probably just before university, and it's kind of strange that I chose history because in many ways I was more interested in science.
Okay.
And I think eventually that interest eventually surfaced again, of course, when you get a historian sort of trying to teach about Big Bang cosmology and things like that.
Right. Okay, fair enough. And so then what were exactly the origins of big history then as a field and, your work?
You know how you tend to mythologize your own changes in your own thinking. From my own point of view, I taught Russian history for many years. By training, I'm a Russian historian. My first job was in Russian history. And during the Cold War, Russia seemed really important. I felt it was really important to be trying to give more than a caricatured understanding of Russia to young Australians. But eventually, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia ceased to be so significant, and the Soviet Union ceased to be so significant, although it's now significant for all the wrong reasons again. And I think I had always had a feeling that history is not just about the past, it should be about the deepest and most meaningful questions of all. So my colleagues thought I was going through a sort of midlife crisis, but what happened in the mid to late 80s was that I began toying with the idea of how big should history be. No world history was taught in Australia at that time, so I didn't know about the idea of world history, which was much more familiar in the States. So I thought maybe you could teach about the whole history of humanity. So I think we're in a globalized world where 8 billion humans are in more and more ways interlinked, and their fate is interlinked. So I thought we should really be teaching histories of humanity, not of Russians or of Australians or Americans or Chinese people. And then I thought, how do you teach the history of humanity? Well, you'd have to begin by talking about how humans evolved. So you'd have to talk about biology. And then once you start doing that, you have to talk about how primates evolved, how mammals evolved. So that means talking about the whole history of life on Earth. And these questions dragged me further and further and further. And then I thought, well, then I have to talk about the planet itself. How did it come to exist? Why is it life-friendly? And that led me to think about, the sun and the solar system and the origins of the whole universe. So I began thinking, I wonder if it's possible to teach history, to teach the whole of history.
Right.
Going back as far as you could. I mean, there's a kind of extremist project, and I think my colleagues, very nice people, but they thought this was just a bit weird and extremist. But I was really attracted by this idea. And eventually I started putting together ideas about what a course might look like. And I thought some students, at least, are going to find this very exciting. And through a series of bureaucratic accidents, my colleagues were all looking for someone willing to take on a large first-year course. And I stuck up my hand, and no one else did. And so I think what they did was they were really worried about this, but they thought, okay, let's give it a go. And from the start, it attracted huge numbers of students from many disciplines, as you can imagine. I recruited lecturers from many different fields. And for the first few years, I had no idea what I was doing. Really, I mean, we got lectures from astronomers, geologists, biologists, and then archaeologists, historians. And they didn't quite fit together because each specialist talked in the jargon of their own discipline.
Ah,
But
okay.
what was really exciting for me was over several years, this is in the early 90s, I sat in on all the lectures, of course, and I began giving more and more of them. I saw a coherent story emerging, and the language for that story, language that would cross all the disciplines. And eventually I convinced myself, I didn't convince a lot of other people, but I convinced myself that there was a coherent story here, that it was a very powerful story, and that it had something of the power of traditional religious stories, origin stories, because it was a story about everything. And
Yeah.
as an educator, I believe strongly, passionately, that at some point in their careers, students need to encounter stories about everything. I mean, of course, they all do, but very, very often they encounter religious stories set within different religious traditions. So they know of some people whose story is different. So my idea was science, insofar as people commit to it, is a global language. I mean, if you're a scientist in Beijing or you're a scientist in Durban, you talk basically the same language. So is it possible to tell a similar story of origins that's set within the thinking of modern science? I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean it's anti-religion. I mean, it can, a story like this is bound to borrow a lot from religious traditions, but it is going to differ from them in many ways. For example, as a scientific account of the history of the Earth, I will argue that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, not 6,000 years old.
Right.
So that's a very long answer to your question, Ben.
No, but I mean it's good because it's the details there that matter and help shape, what exactly is going on with big history. And I mean, I think you're absolutely right that, people need some type of story to kind of understand, where they come from. And the good news is that, the big history story is a story that's based on evidence and not based on, just religious ideas that are being passed down, kind of blindly. Because I mean, even when people are thinking about just their families, you talk about your family story, your family history, where did your family come from? So
Absolutely.
it's a kind of a human element of understanding, I suppose, sort of the big picture of how we got here, and it's very very cool and interesting, I think, and inspiring in many
Like
ways.
there's a set of Matryoshka dolls that begins with "Who am I? What's my origin?
Right.
What's my family? Who's my clan or tribe or nation? Who's humanity?" And within that set of Matryoshka dolls, eventually you get to the biggest of them all. But each of those ways of framing the story can give you insights into other ways of framing the story. And I think one of the big problems today is that so many people are caught between competing stories. Um, and that leads to a lot of sort of existential confusion. And it may be that I've been adding to that existential confusion, but in a global world, you cannot escape the fact that different people have committed to different origin stories.
Oh yes.
And
Yeah.
my bet is simply on the future of an origin story based on modern science, an origin story for the modern world. And once again, I repeat, that doesn't mean pushing away religious traditions. It means pushing away some of the details of those traditions, but it doesn't mean pushing away many of their ethical insights or moral insights.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that that's one of the interesting things then that I'm curious to talk about with you, and that's just kind of comparing, I guess what one could call like sort of the more traditional history that people have been taught compared to like big history. And obviously, sort of the more traditional history we'll have, we'll talk about kind of the nitty gritty details of some aspects of human societies and civilization that big history may not really go into in depth as
That's
much
right.
on.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, big, you can think of the work historians do. Most of the work professional historians do. And I've been a professional historian, that's been my career.
Yeah.
Clusters around a particular group of Matryoshka dolls. And those really, in the last century or two, that cluster, the best way I can describe it is by saying it's dominated by the national scale, the scale of a nation state. The personal scale, the biographical scale is very important. Sometimes a slightly larger civilizational scale is important. World history goes to the next scale. But even most world history is not actually about humanity. It's about the modern world. You look at the syllabi. I believe the AP world history courses in the
Yeah.
States have now cut everything before 1200, which I have to say appalls me, absolutely
Yeah, me
appalls me.
too. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's pretty disturbing. I mean, my master's was in a combination of big history and ancient studies, so that pretty much leaves me out of it. And it's I think, and especially and beyond that, I mean, I've always found that the AP classes also don't really teach history from my experiences, because it's mostly just regurgitating facts on paper and a lot of memorization, which it's great if you can memorize, random bits of history, but you don't actually understand anything when you're spitting it out on a
Yeah.
test.
I mean, I suppose I've always felt, I've always been fascinated by the big existential questions. I'm not religious in a conventional sense,
Right.
despite my surname. I mean, I grew up in a sort of Anglican tradition, but I think as a late teenager, just all the logical contradictions in it
Sure.
just got me. And I never went back to it. I was never. I mean, I adore religious music. So, I'm still seduced by some aspects of traditional religion. When I say religious music, that includes, by the way, sort of some aspects of Muslim music. It's not just
Sure. Yeah.
the Christian tradition. It just didn't work for me. For some people, it clearly works. Those stories are still inspirational. They help them think about the most fundamental things. For me, it never did. So I felt I had to look for a story within science that could help me think as deeply about all the big existential questions as religious traditions do. And I believe that if you're teaching history, one of your jobs is to use history as a vehicle for helping students to ask about where is it all going? I mean, today particularly, that's an absolutely riveting question for young people.
Yeah.
If you're 20 now, you're thinking, in my 50s, will I be in a world in decline? Is there anything I can do now to change that? So that's one of the reasons I love big history. It's a very powerful vehicle partly because it's unfamiliar to many people, for thinking
Yeah.
about the deepest possible questions about existence, why we're here, is there meaning to the universe, all of those wonderful deep questions that I think every young person ought to be asking and ought to be encouraged to ask.
Yeah. I mean, I think it just has it's kind of it's basically relevant to everyone's life, in ways that just a normal history class isn't, because it's something, I don't know any person that at some point in their life isn't thinking about these big questions, like, why are we here? Where do we come from? That's just kind of, I think, human nature of trying to understand your existence in the first place. And big history is something that talks about that, while, lots of history classes, obviously, most history classes would never touch on such a subject. A religious class might, but,
Yeah.
that's the thing. So,
And it's strangely in the 19th century, I mean, it's now very conventional among historians to be very critical of 19th century historians, and quite rightly in many ways. They were racist, they were
Sure.
chauvinist, they were, all those things I agree with. But one thing that they did was they always kept sight of these very big questions. And all the big thinkers of the 19th century had their eye on those questions. The answers they gave may be ones that just don't work today, but they had their eye on those questions. And somehow or other, many of the humanities disciplines, even though the word human is built into the idea of humanities, lost sight of the idea of humanity and the question, what is our species? What sort of creature are we? Why are we so powerful that we can change a planet, which is what we're doing right now? What is it about us? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that I guess one of the disappointing things that I feel like for a lot of students when they get into a history classroom is just finding it kind of maybe too specialized on certain subjects, and you're getting so deep in the weeds of a topic that you just can't follow it, and you're very bored. As a result, you walk away not liking history, and that's when it's something that's so relevant to people's lives. The whole world is shaped on those that came before us, and when we're making decisions about things, obviously having a good understanding of the past is a crucial aspect to making good decisions for the future. But I feel like in many ways, the way that history is taught has turned off a lot of people. And I mean, we see this with, record declines in the US and the number of history majors, for example. It's
I
just,
agree.
people just don't see it as being useful. And, I think that's detrimental to society in the long run.
Yeah, and I agree. My own idea, I couldn't prove it really, is that one of the reasons for the decline of interest in the humanities is that they used to be useful in a kind of philosophical sense, and existential sense, that they were powerful ways of helping you think about deep questions. Science is very good at sort of technical things, helping you do things. It's often less good at helping you think about deep existential issues, and the humanities were really good at that. But what happened, I think, maybe as they tried to imitate the sciences, they sort of narrowed the scale of questions they asked, and they stopped asking those questions. So they don't give you the technical skills that scientists acquire, but no longer do they give you the existential skills that a course in theology might begin to give you, or in some forms of philosophy.
Yeah.
So I think humanities, in many ways, they narrowed their scope, partially perhaps in an attempt to imitate the success of the sciences. And so no wonder they've I think have lost their way. But having said that, what happened in the 20th century is that we got a kind of definition of what's real history. And to use the metaphor I've used already, of sort of 20 matryoshka dolls, real history focuses on 4 or 5 or 6 of them. And many people do love just the details, and they are a bit nervous about the big existential questions. And I think that helps explain partly the resistance to big history. You said it yourself. Many people, if you do big history, you won't learn about the American Civil War.
Right.
It's too small an event.
Yeah.
And many people think, how can you do a history course without learning about the American Civil War? Because they have this very clear idea of the scale at which history operates. So there's huge resistance to big history. And I naively thought that when I began teaching it, that, everyone's going to think, wow, what a great way of thinking about the past. Surely every student at some point in their career should do a big history course. Then they can go back, they can look at the other Matryoshka dolls, but they'll always be aware that the particular Matryoshka doll they're looking at is one of many.
Right.
That each of those scales has something to say to the other scales. So, but there's huge resistance to big history. I think personally, I think it's kind of sad, but I've slowly over the years become aware of how great is the resistance. And among professional historians, of course, their ideas, their self-identity is bound up, sense of what is real history.
Yeah.
And so many of them think of something like big history as sort of play history.
Okay.
Not quite serious, not quite the real thing. And obviously, I just find that very sad.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because I mean, my undergraduate degree was just in normal history, and going through that and comparing it to my master's experience. I always kind of felt that big history. I mean, yes, it's very different than traditional history, and traditional history will cover very specific things. You mentioned the Civil War. Yes, lots of stuff like that, but I've always looked at big history as kind of just laying the foundation for thinking about things in the big picture. And then for those things that you're more interested in, you can go into the traditional historical fields and go deeper. And I always felt like they complement each other, because like it's
Exactly.
all things. If you're taking a science class, it's good to have kind of a general idea of understanding, biology before you're going into the nitty gritty details of all the
Yeah,
different,
exactly.
microscopic organisms and then being totally lost. And I actually think that this is a problem in a lot of the sciences as well, where they teach it in a way that's so overly complex that when you're entering the classroom, a lot of people are turned away from science because it's like, I can't possibly understand this. Lots of memorization. Again, um, I just feel like in general, a lot of subjects are not taught very well because we're not giving people the foundation to understanding the more complex aspects of those fields. And as a result, we're turning away lots of talent because of that. And I
Yeah.
think big history does a great job of alleviating that issue and then getting people interested so they can go in deeper to different particular subject areas and master those as well. Um,
Yeah. I mean, if I can just take further the metaphor I've been using it. You say big history is a foundation, and I know many of my colleagues in history get a bit irritated if I say something like that. But to use this metaphor of the matryoshka dolls,
yeah,
it's a container,
yeah,
uh, and maybe in some ways that's a more helpful way of thinking about it. But I think one of the crucial things is, if you are familiar with matryoshka dolls at different scales, then that gives you a kind of intellectual flexibility because you can move up and down the scales. And I think very often the sciences are very aware of this. I mean, someone like Einstein is a wonderful example, because those revolutionary articles he wrote in 1905, each of which could have won a Nobel Prize, and he was in his 20s and working in a patent office in I think it was Bern in Switzerland. Each of them begins with a tiny problem, um, about the way photons affect a photoelectric cell, or questions about, the speed of light and things like that. And then by the end of them, they've got you've reached ideas that provide a framework for thinking about the whole universe. I mean, it's astonishing, absolutely astonishing. And that ability to move from the detail to the very large and to see the links between them is something which I think we've lost as discipline after discipline has come to define itself and even put borders around. It's a bit like nation states, really.
yeah.
Those borders are often very well policed. I crossed those borders without a passport. And there are some people who I know I lost sort of academic credibility with some people as a result of that. I ceased to do the things that a proper historian does, just because these conventions are so powerful. And I've got huge respect for history, very well done
Sure.
at conventional scales. I love it. I love very, very fine history at those scales. My own beef is simply that I think it is valuable to look at multiple scales, which is something that the great French historian Fernand Braudel argued very famously, although his largest scale was a few hundred years, not 13.8 billion.
That's true. I mean, yeah, I guess for a lot of historians, they don't really, I guess, get the point of it, and they just see it as kind of just kind of like, overgeneralized history that takes out a lot of the human elements to it. And I think they're just kind of missing the idea. And I think this happens in general a lot in academia, where people kind of can be threatened by lots of things. They're very used to their way, and in academia, people love to argue about stuff. So I guess it's kind of normal to a certain extent. But yeah, I mean, I think that it seems strange to me that people wouldn't incorporate the idea of what was before this and what was before that when it comes to analyzing their fields and history. Ignoring the 13.8 billion years of existence, and the Big Bang, these things. It's very bizarre, because you would think at a time when we have so much more scientific knowledge of these things than people would, several hundred years ago, that this would be more incorporated into fields, because it's incredibly important to know that aspect of existence and how things came to be. But yeah, there has been pushback to it, and I've read articles about it, but I just never understood it. I mean, it's funny. One story I remember when I was in high school looking at history, and my father was actually a Russian historian as well, ironically.
Really?
Yeah, he studied in Russia in the Soviet Union for several years, and but so I was always thinking about history, and I remember thinking to myself in high school, and I never really enjoyed the AP history classes. I just couldn't stand those with all the the random memorization things, but I always liked history. And I remember thinking to myself, like, why don't we look at history, going back further than, ancient times, and looking at incorporating scientific stuff to this, and, like evolution and the Big Bang. And then a colleague of my dad's mentioned me, well, have you ever heard of big history? I was like, what, big history? And then I realized that, you've already done it. So, so I was like, wow, I gotta look up this field. So I got really interested in big history from that point on, because I was thinking in that way that you were. I just didn't know that someone was already doing this, and that had laid out so much of a foundational element of a field. And so that was very cool for me.
Ben, I fear we're both preaching to the choir here.
To a certain extent,
So
I suppose.
I think I am blind to the challenges that big history puts to other people. But one of the arguments that always seems incredibly powerful to me, but not at all powerful to my colleagues, is again along the lines of what you were just saying. If someone says to you, "What's the point in studying history?" I mean, after all, I've just written a book about the future. That's where we're going to spend the rest of our lives, not in the past, in the future. So why do we study the future? Why do we study the past? If you, as a historian, want to justify your profession, I know of only one justification, which is that all our preparation for the future comes from studying the past. And what we look for in the past is patterns that give us just a few hints about what might be coming in the near future. They're very probabilistic hints. It's a bit like betting on the horses. But if that's true, then a very simple question arises. If the past is crucial to helping me prepare for the future, what scale should I study the past at? Should I study the past at the scale of 100 years, 200, 300, which is the limit for most high school courses, unless you're lucky enough to do ancient history, in which case it may be 2,000 or 3,000 years. Why stop there? If studying the past helps us prepare for the future, shouldn't we study the past at all scales? Shouldn't the history of the universe give us some clues about fundamental patterns of change? And I believe it does. Or shouldn't the history of humanity give us some clues? And again, it does. For example, we're a migratory species. If you look over 200 or 300,000 years of human history, we're a migratory species. Now, does that help us think about the future? Well, I think so, because it means
Yeah.
there's a very, very strong likelihood, no guarantee, that our pattern of migration will continue into the future. We've already traveled to the moon. We've sent artificial satellites to other planets in our solar system. So there's a sort of prediction based on a long trend in the past. So that's the question that really gets me. If we study the past in order to prepare ourselves for the world that's coming, for the world we live in, why not study the past at all scales? Why not study all the Matryoshka dolls?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. And I mean, one of the things I've always noticed, because I think that in some cases, um, you know, given the pushback among some historians, you almost kind of have to propose some type of fusion of ideas. And I know people have talked about this before to a certain extent, but one things I've always kind of witnessed is that just the big history methodology in general of like having phases to something, I think is very applicable to any historical field you're studying. Because if you're, in today's world, especially in places like the US, where uh, political questions are often intersecting with history all the time, you know, a lot of people don't have good foundational knowledge of that historical subject. But if they had sort of a big history like mentality to it, where you're looking at the phases of how we got here, I think that would alleviate a lot of the confusion that people have when it comes to understanding the complexities of problems and challenges. And so, I mean, even on in this podcast, I like to do like the history of various subjects. And I'll give a few historical examples of things that are relevant today in the political debates that we have as societies, and just show like these things aren't unusual. In fact, they're normal. But we continue to figure out ways to solve these problems. But the amount of historical sort of ignorance among the general public is quite high, and I think again goes back to the idea that people just aren't interested because history is not being taught in a way that grasps people's interest, and it's because it's just overly convoluted, and to a certain extent, I think academics also kind of can have this mentality sometimes of it's my way or the highway, and you can't look at questions in different ways. And it's allowing for that flexibility and creativity that I think is really important for the future of history as a field. And hopefully more people can sort of get interested in big history, and if not big history, just the sort of the mindset of it when examining questions.
Yeah, I agree. And what scares me in particular in looking at current political debate, I guess particularly in the States, but I
Yeah.
mean even here in Australia too, is the extent to which the question, what is the truth, has faded into the background,
Yeah.
and the question, what does my gang think,
Right.
has come to the front. So I don't really care what the truth is. This is what my people say,
Yeah.
and that scares me witless, because we suddenly live in a world in which mistakes could be existential. 100 years ago, the most powerful weapons on earth were machine guns and cannon, and with one of those you could kill quite 20, 30, 40, 50 enemy soldiers. In the middle of the 20th century, we developed weapons that could destroy much of the biosphere in 24 hours if we're
Yeah.
foolish enough to release them. So So war in the past, war was always horrible, but it was there were survivors. Now we live in a world where there could be no survivors. So the significance of ideologies based on gang warfare or tribalism has completely changed.
Yeah.
In the past, those ideologies made a sort of sense. And nationalism, by the way, is one of them. Um, my, you know, and so we need increasingly to see ourselves as part of a larger community, not members of competing gangs, because we now live in a world where that competition could prove catastrophic in a way that was never true in the past. We need to see ourselves as members of humanity. Now, the way we teach history at the moment doesn't help at all, because history syllabi everywhere in the world are still dominated by nationalist agenda.
Yeah.
Every time you see a word like Chinese or Australian or American used as an adjective to describe whole groups of people, you're seeing that gang warfare at work. And I think it's absolutely vital that we start helping young people see themselves. Of course, I mean, a young American is a young American, and in many ways, their American identity is really important, and I wouldn't want to undermine it. But we need to teach them that there's another identity as well, which is their identity as human beings now engaged on the common project of trying to protect the planet, which we suddenly find ourselves in charge of. And our teaching at the moment does not help.
Yeah.
Our teaching, the propaganda, much of our literature, the newspapers do not help there. Where are the histories of humanity? And I think of big history as a way of approaching that idea of seeing you first encounter human beings in big history, not as American human beings or Chinese human beings, but as members of a species, as people who overwhelmingly share the same genes. You know, we're very genetically homogenous as a
Yeah.
species. That sort of insight is becoming increasingly necessary in a globalized world where the solutions to the big problems will require collaboration between Chinese governments and American governments, between Russian and Ukrainian governments, as laughable as that idea may seem at the moment.
Right.
And our education system at the moment actually empowers gang ideologies, including nationalist ideology. Sorry about the rant, Ben, but
No, I mean,
one more reason why I feel passionately about big history.
yeah.
I think it's a powerful way of teaching young people their new role, which is as collective global managers of a planet. And that's something new.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think big history offers that unifying element that, traditional historical narratives doesn't. And because it's not looking at, okay, where you come from in terms of your country or ethnicity or religious background, but it's looking at where we all come from, regardless of all that. And I think that's incredibly humbling for people and incredibly interesting and also inspiring. I mean, one of the things I always like to talk to people about, partially coming from my background studying big history is just the billions of years that led to you. I mean, it's incredible. We're here, and it's pretty amazing that we're even here in the first place. And so it's like, yet despite this, we're wasting so much time over bickering over just trivial things and lots of things that really are not important for the future of our species. Right.
Yeah.
But
I think from now on, increasingly, whenever I read somewhere, I read Australians are racist. Well, there's clearly plenty of people in Australia who are racist by very precise definitions.
Sure.
But there are lots of people who really don't fit that description. So the phrase Australia is racist, or, Americans are used to playing a dominant role in the world and treating other nations with disrespect. You hear a phrase like that.
Yeah.
Well, some Americans that may be true of. But whenever you hear these adjectives used in a way that, if the police did it, you'd call it profiling, of course.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
then you know that this is one of the bad and dangerous consequences of an educational system that is still dominated by nationalism, and with very good reason. If a national government funds education to a considerable extent, it wants its citizens to think of themselves primarily as citizens of this particular government. So there's very powerful reasons why the national Matryoshka doll dominates education in the humanities, and that's why you get this sort of profiling language everywhere. And in a world with nuclear weapons and global pandemics, and a world in which we're threatening to undermine the global climate system, that sort of thinking is simply dangerous, and not so dangerous for older people like
Sure.
me, but dangerous for younger people like yourself and my gorgeous 2-year-old granddaughter, Sophia. And
Yeah.
that really scares me.
Yeah, it's pretty disturbing, and unfortunately, we see people doing this, especially in the U.S. I mean, across the political spectrum. It's lots of attention seeking by putting out headlines and things in the media, and just people making over exaggerated statements, kind of weaponizing words any way they can to push a political agenda and whatnot. And I think that also just uh, really solidifies the need for sort of big history like methodology when it comes to understanding the history of people doing that thing itself. I think Escher Claudacker is like called this type of stuff like little big histories is what she was calling it, where you're taking a topic that's much smaller but using the big history methodology to break it down and understand the history of it. And I think understanding the history of how people can create propaganda, for example, and its long history going back to the ancient world. When people realize that, I think that people then start to look for it more when they know that there's a precedent for it, and it's not new. But because that there's such a gap in historical knowledge, a lot of people miss this and they fall for the same tricks that people did thousands of years ago, just in the modern setting. So, yeah, I mean, any way we can to really get people thinking big picture about things, I think the better when it comes to helping people navigate this world where on social media you can read basically any idea or concept regardless of evidence and walk away from it thinking that, oh wow, this must be correct, accurate information. So
And also, Ben, I think the challenge is very new. I love the idea of the Anthropocene. The world has changed profoundly in my lifetime. As I said about weapons, before about a century ago, many of these problems were serious, and they could have terrible consequences locally. But suddenly we live in a world where this sort of combative thinking could bring the whole thing down.
yeah.
That's what's new, and it's new because our power, our impact, the power of our weapons, the impact of our greenhouse gas emissions has all accelerated so sharply since the middle of the 20th century that suddenly what we humans do in the next 50 years will shape the future of an entire planet for thousands, maybe millions of years. Now, 2 centuries ago, you couldn't have said that. So, a mad politician in one country could do a lot of damage, but they were unlikely to destroy much of the biosphere. Today, everything's changed.
Yeah.
Simply because our power as a species has suddenly become so much greater. It's become planetary. And that's why we need to mobilize on planetary scales in order to make sure that we don't use that power in destructive ways.
Yeah, I mean, it is a very dangerous situation, and also, the idea of, yeah, like one person having the power to do something like launch a nuclear weapon, just reiterates the importance of having, some type of government and countries with nuclear weapons that has sort of a checks and balances to someone's power, because yeah, the stakes are much higher today now than they were, thousands of years ago. And
Yeah.
with authoritarian regimes, really not fading away anytime soon, and even democratic regimes, struggling to even maintain their democracies, it's really concerning. Because you always wonder, is that sort of just bare minimum rationality not to launch a nuclear weapon going to be there? So
Yeah, yeah. Strangely, the checks and balances are there, not even not just in
yeah,
democratic society. You may be aware of the fact that over the last 30 or 40 years, there have been several near misses in terms of launching nuclear weapons.
yes, that's true.
Several of them
Yep, that's
were
right.
stopped because individuals somewhere on the chain of command didn't
Yeah,
instantly obey.
that's right.
And in launching missiles, 20 seconds could be crucial because that's long enough for an order to come in and say, sorry, that was a false alarm. Don't launch that weapon.
Yeah, that's right.
And so in a strange sense, the checks and balances are there even in fairly authoritarian regimes. Um, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's true. Yeah, there's historical examples of that, and I think, yeah, that's a lot something that people probably do take for granted. And it's just like, I think when people sort of are thinking about how dangerous a place is, it's like when people think of a nation that's authoritarian, they may think, oh, if as soon as I step in that country, I'll be arrested and put in prison the rest of my life. Majority of people passing through won't have that issue. And when it comes to people, the threat of nuclear war, for example, yes, there are people that you would think and have historically stepped up and, like, whoa, wait a minute. So I guess we would see, I guess it would depend a lot on whether like an authoritarian leader were to give an order and who would be willing to step up. And you would hope that there would be someone that would step up, realizing, that their own demise, their own life would be at stake if they were to
Yeah.
follow through. So yeah, I mean, I guess there's hope there that there are enough people around to recognize problems, even if they don't appear there. So,
No, I say that because I'm certainly a small d Democrat in the sense that I think democracy is a good system when it works.
right.
But I say all of that because I'm seeing more and more rhetoric recently in which the world is divided into authoritarian and democratic states. I
Sure.
understand the logic of that.
Yep.
But if that rhetoric turns into one more form of profiling,
Mm,
then it turns into one more form of sort of gang warfare, and it crushes the many, many attempts to build bridges between different societies. And at the moment, of course, the bridges between the US and China
sure.
look really crucial. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think that's a great point. I've spent a fair amount of time in dictatorships around the world, and I think people have to understand that there is kind of also well, we'd hope, but I think for many countries there is kind of an evolutionary path in terms of becoming more open for a lot of countries. Not all follow that pattern, but we have seen lots of countries. I mean, look at all the countries in Europe that used to be monarchies that, shed being authoritarian monarchy to having, parliaments and stuff like that. There's a history of people reforming over time. And I think it is a big mistake for people just to think, oh, well, if it's an authoritarian nation, we can't try to do anything with them. And it's just all us versus them. That's how you get unnecessary wars that don't lead to any change, and just kind of get people digging in. But when you're in a world that we're all in this together, whether we want to be or not, you do have to have relationships and work towards something despite differences.
Yeah.
It's
And
important.
one of the advantages of the wide lens of big history is that it helps you see the positives in this story, because it's very easy to say, look, humans have always fought each other. They always will fight each other. Well, yes, there will always be conflicts of interest, and those conflicts of interest may sometimes take violent forms. But if you look at the whole trajectory of human history, you can also see very powerful mechanisms for building cohesion and loyalty. And paradoxically, nationalism was one of those. If you look at the Shakespeare history plays, you're looking at a stage in British history where the sense of I should say English history, where the sense of an English nation was still very fuzzy. So you have conflicting gangs fighting, but in an era in which there was emerging a sense that everyone who lives in England owes loyalty to this larger structure of Britain rather than to local feudal principalities of various kinds. Well, I see the step from where we are today to a kind of global citizenship as very similar in its way, as more and more people are aware of the things that connect them to the globe as a whole.
Yeah.
And the powerful and the dangers of conflict, the existential dangers of conflict, and the need for collaboration. I mean, you saw a lot of it actually during the pandemic.
Yeah.
So we are now so closely globally connected. The fact that I can talk to you in Indianapolis from Sydney is stunning,
Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely stunning. And of course, the COVID virus could travel around the world on airlines, within 24, 48 hours. So we are so globally connected that I think we will see a shift towards a wider global loyalty. Now, will it happen soon enough? Will it affect government policy soon enough? Those are the questions that can keep me awake at night.
Sure. Well, I think that's the big thing, because I mean, I think about the average person around the globe. Pretty much the average person, I think, is all on the same page with each other in terms of what we want. We all want to live in a peaceful existence. I mean, I've had people on this podcast from all over the world, whether it's Russia or India, Australia and more. And, we're all, for the most part, pretty much the same. I mean, yeah, everyone has different opinions about certain things or whatever, but no one wants nuclear wars or anything. That's not in anyone's interest. And ultimately it's sort of governments that set a lot of these agendas that are kind of against other governments. But for most part, people don't have, the average person has no skin in the game for a lot of those things. And it's, I guess, to a certain extent, it's up to people to kind of try to keep their governments in check if they can, and try to help shape that policy, that foreign policy they have with other nations. At the end of the day, there's more people, more average people than the government officials that are in power for the moment. And obviously governments change, as they always will. So.
Yep. I in the book I've just published, which is on the future, I was forced to try to stick my neck out and make some predictions about the future.
Okay.
And I found myself very positive. Of course, this is all probabilistic. It is like betting on the horses. The winner could trip and fall over,
Sure.
but I found myself more and more positive, partly because we are so astonishingly clever as a species. We know a lot. We know the dangers of global warming. We know the dangers of manufactured pandemics. There's no guarantee we'll actually deal with those dangers, but at least we have the knowledge. And if you look at the rhetoric of governments over the last 20 or 30 years on issues like climate change, in the early 90s, no government in the world really took climate change seriously. Now, we live in an era in which I believe every member of the United Nations has signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals, which include all sorts of commitments on climate change, on poverty, on inequality. Now, you can be very cynical about this. We can guarantee that a hell of a lot of those commitments won't be met. But nevertheless, a world in which every government has formally made those commitments is very different from the world of 30 years ago, in which no one had. And watching the speed with which sustainable new technologies are taking off, again, I think is grounds for optimism. It's no guarantees of a pleasant future, but it's grounds for optimism. So I basically found myself feeling fairly optimistic about the future. And one more thing, I found myself realizing that optimism itself is a tool for building a better future, because dystopias in many ways are much more fun. They're more fun to write. They're probably more fun to watch. Hence all the kind of television series, that are based on dystopias. But optimism is crucial if you're to solve a problem. You need the optimism that the problem is solvable. So I think it's really important to maintain a sense that the problems we face are solvable, because if we go around saying, no, they're insoluble, we're lost, you disempower people, you dispirit them, you undermine their optimism, you undermine their creativity, and we're less likely to solve the problems that we face.
Yeah, I agree. I've always found it hard to understand how people couldn't be optimistic about the future when you look at the past and just everything that we've already overcome as a species and the fact that we're here. I mean, I don't think that, I feel like it's hard to, at least from my perspective, to feel like we're entitled to be here. And I feel like in many ways, it's just like, it's amazing that we're here. And because we've gotten this far, I mean, that suggests that, we are capable of solving problems. We are capable of being better. I mean, look at, all that we've created in terms of technology and extending lifespans of human beings. I mean, people generally want to help each other. And, events, all these global events, you look at, things like the World Cup or the Olympics, and certainly they have flaws when it comes to politics and whatnot. But the fact that people are getting together from around the world, I mean, that would never happen, hundreds and
Exactly.
hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago. No one could ever imagine that thing ever
Exactly.
occurring. So yeah, I can't help but also feel positive. And I think that people that are not positive kind of get stuck in sort of this presentism where they're only looking at their understanding of their life and not looking at the long history of everything before it.
Exactly. Just think of something like slavery.
Yep.
250 years ago, slavery was regarded as normal and morally acceptable in most countries on earth, and it had a history that went back hundreds, thousands of
Yeah.
years. It was regarded as normal. The idea that men and women had fundamentally different roles in society, that women were bound to be excluded from many of the leadership roles, many of the crucial roles. I mean, those ideas were absolutely dominant. 250 years ago. So the shifts in thinking have been really profound in the last 250 years. But again, you're absolutely right. If you just look at history through a narrow lens, if you operate with the wrong Matryoshka dolls,
Yeah.
you won't see the many positives in the history of the last few. It's easy to see the negatives. I mean, the
Yep.
casualties in war, the fact the fact that there still is a lot of slavery in the world, the fact that gender equality still has a long, long way to go. That's all true. But if you look slightly further back, you can see many positives in history as well as negatives.
Yeah, and I think this ties back to what we're talking about in terms of how history is taught, because I think because it's becoming increasingly more about recent history, everything that's happened with the last couple hundred years, people basically are taking for granted the progress that we've made over time, and
Yeah.
it's much easier to be pessimistic if your view of history is as that limited. So without a big picture type mentality to study this, we're kind of betraying our abilities as a society to understand progress and why we should be optimistic, I think.
Yep. I agree.
So, uh, so I guess then I'm curious. We've talked a lot about big history, but given you've coined this term and been so influential into its growth, how would you summarize big history to the average person who has never heard of big history, for example? I have, lots of people listening to this. Um, what would you say is big history to them then?
Look, the phrase "big history," I'm not sure is that happy a coinage. I coined the phrase because I needed some sort of label for
Right.
this, and it seemed cute at the time. But I know it annoys some people because it implies that all other histories are small, which was not the intention of the phrase at all. Anyway, whatever label we use, and the label "big history" has kind of is now fairly widespread. Um, I see big history as simply an attempt to learn from the past at multiple scales. And I also see big history as the attempt to construct within the traditions of modern science something like a traditional origin story. That is to say, a story that offers contemporary answers to all the big existential questions about why does the universe exist? Where did it come from? Why do we exist? How do we exist? Is there meaning? Is there meaning to all of this? And insofar as the past can provide some sort of guidance for the future, looking at the deep past is a crucial way of thinking about the future. That was true of all religious traditions as well. All religious traditions have origin stories built into them. Having grown up in the Christian world, I was familiar with the Christian origin story. But that is big history. It tells you about how the universe was created. It tells you how we were created. It tells you also about some of our obligations. And strangely, I think the modern origin story tells us about some of our obligations. If we care about our family, our children, our descendants, then science can point to some things that we absolutely have to do as moral imperatives. And they include things like avoiding nuclear war. So that I think of big history as doing many of the things that traditional religious traditions have done, but within but it's a story that's embedded within the best of modern science. And that's a very positive thing, because modern science can tell us better than any earlier science about the nature of the world we live in. And it gives us immense power over that world, for better or for worse.
Yes.
And may we use that power for good.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And so how do you think the field of big history has grown then over time, and how do you think it will continue to grow?
It's I'm now retired, so I in a sense I watch more
Yeah.
dispassionately.
Yeah.
I suppose that personally I have a sense of disappointment. I thought that big history I would love to see something like big history, maybe under another label, being taught in every school and every university in the world. Now, at the moment, that's simply not true. It's a marginal course. It's taught in some universities. It's taught in some high schools. But the positive side of it all is when I began thinking about this 30 years ago, something like this seemed completely unthinkable for professional historians. Many of them said this is just a throwback to 19th century ways of approaching history. Whereas nowadays, what I can say for big history is that, like it or not, as a historian, it's there. It's now something you have to be aware of the fact that it is possible to think about the whole of the past on all possible scales and across multiple disciplines, from cosmology to astronomy to geology to biology to archaeology and so on. So big history exists. That's the good news. It's not been anything like as influential as I would have liked to see. It's not been taken up in school or university syllabi in a way that I would like to see. That's the best assessment I can make. But I also am fairly confident that something like big history is going to be the sort of education that future generations will need, because it'll help them see the links between disciplines. It'll give them a much better appreciation of the larger trajectory of a global society of which all are now part.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that would make sense because I mean, when I look at in the US, especially at the declines in enrollment, I think a lot of universities are starting to get a little desperate for finding ways of getting people more interested and going back to the university. And they're cutting lots and lots of programs in the humanities, especially because they're just not making any money. So reinventing some of these things with maybe more of a big history flavor to them, or something like it, could be a way of helping fix those issues and getting more people back in those programs. So I guess we'll hope for the best. I mean, it's definitely something that more people should be aware of, but already a lot of people are aware of it. So it's I'm finding myself less and less having to explain what it is, big history is. That's good whenever I talk about my background. So,
Yeah.
but yeah. So what are you currently working on then? Any future books you're thinking of doing,
I'm retired,
or just
and
done?
I think I think that's the end of my research. I'm sort of
Okay.
going in new directions, and enjoying retirement, enjoying family.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
great.
and you can see a digital piano in the background.
Oh,
I've
there you go.
for years wanted to teach myself the piano, so I'm starting doing that. I'm catching up on some reading that I didn't feel I could do when my reading was dominated by books that I felt I ought to read for my career. Rereading Russian literature. I'm rereading Anna Karenina, and gobsmacked at how wonderful the writing is. A lot of the writing. It's I reread War and Peace recently. So
Wow.
going back to older interests, but now
Yeah.
doing it for fun,
Yeah.
rather than because I had to prepare a lecture.
Yeah. Well, as you should. I mean, that's the good thing about retirement is you can do what you want now and enjoy other
Sort of, yeah.
interests.
Yeah.
And what would be the best way for people to, reach out to you, or if they want to follow you? I'm not sure how active you are on social media these days, but
I'm not active on social media these days. I
okay.
used to have a Twitter account. I don't have a Facebook account.
Okay.
Um, so I'm as I say, I'm now watching the evolution of big history, but very much as an observer rather than a
Sure.
participant these days. Yeah, and of course, wish it well
Yeah,
because I believe passionately that it's important. Hmm.
definitely. Well,
I
yeah, I mean,
recently took part in an online discussion run by the Great Transition Initiative, which you may know of.
okay.
And the discussion was about the role of big history in the transition to a sustainable future.
Hmm.
And it was interesting, really, partly because there was a lot of pushback of exactly the sort we've been discussing. You know, a sense that big history is irrelevant because its scales are too large to include the human, which I, of course, think is completely wrong. But so, you know, I'm doing quite a lot of podcasts of various kinds. So
Yeah,
I'm not completely disengaged, but yeah.
cool. Well, I mean, yeah, I think people will continue to look out for you know, you peeking out on podcasts every once in a while, and yeah, definitely people should check out your books. So I
Well,
assume,
I just say the last two books I've done, one in Origin Stories,
yep,
is an attempt at an updated, but also I hope more accessible account of the big history story. So that's the whole of the past. And that left me thinking, what's left? Well, what's left is the future, which is why I wrote Future Stories.
yeah,
So Origin Story and Future Stories, I definitely think of as a pair, one about the future, one about the past, but they both use ideas and insights from many, many different disciplines. And they both move between the scales of big history and those of detailed history. Yeah.
yeah, that's perfect. So some reading that people can do. You know, if they haven't, if they're not familiar with your work, they can go on Amazon and look up your books and go more in depth. So, well, you know, thanks for coming on and sharing
Thank you
all
very
of your
much.
knowledge, and very fun to talk to you, especially since yeah, you've had influence on my life and my career. So I appreciate you coming on and talking. It's been a lot of fun. So
Okay. Thanks a lot.